Well, first of all, thank you to Riccardo for the invitation, and to the Italian Post-Keynesian network for the invitation and for organizing this. I feel a little bit overwhelmed to be invited to talk about this. I think there are too many people that are far more knowledgeable and could provide insights on Garegnani. And I'm also the third one to start speaking, which I don't have a PowerPoint either. I always reminded of that little joke about power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt pointlessly. And so I'm going to try to not repeat myself to some extent, repeat what's been said both by Mark and by Antonella in very coherent sort of way. I will try to point some differences of my perhaps interpretation. I was preparing this, and I had four broad contributions, areas of contributions that Garegnani had sort of had significant work of himself, and then I remember that Fabio Petri, talking about people that would know considerably more than I do, had written the entry for the Palgrave, and he had also those in four categories, and I suppose I had that in the back of my mind without remembering. But my four categories, I'm happy to say, were very close to Petri's, and so I had it in the things on capital debates, in which I include this stuff on the change in the notion of equilibrium, effective demand, which he puts growth and effective demand in one category. I separated those because he has clarifications of Sraffa theory, and I have one that I don't think was brought, and that's why I started from here. I don't want to really discuss all of the categories. That was well done, but Marxism, and I think that's something that Mark said. Mark brought up his very good paper on whether Sraffians should be part of post-Keynesian economics, and earlier today we saw Chandni presenting a paper on new Ricardian contributions to the environment, a term that I'm not sure other Sraffians feel that way, but I feel not positive about. It's a term of derision. It was a term to be insulting, And here's something that I think it's important. Sraffians, and I see Sraffa and Garegnani as part of one big project, so they're a unit in that respect. Are one of the very few heterodox groups that are often discussed in terms of whether they should be part of Marxism. And these are not true Marxists, and they didn't really understand the importance of the labor theory of value, and hence they are Ricardian. And also there is this notion that, they're not really Keynesians. This effective demand thing, they didn't get it, and they didn't get this all uncertainty and expectations and historical time and all of these other things that are sort of incredibly important for the Keynes project. And I think that that's exactly where Garegnani is central. In demystifying those two views, I think that exactly the idea of what I should say, Franklin Serrano is not particularly fond of that term of classical Keynesianism. But so he prefers Sraffian, and but the idea of classical Keynesianism is exactly to bring those two things together, to bring the idea that the theory of value and distribution is central for any discussion of effective demand in the long run, and of course it's only in the long run that this matters. So if we're going to say something different, otherwise we end up with something that it's akin to neoclassical synthesis and short-term Keynesianism and so on and so forth. So in the way I see the importance of Garegnani is exactly similar to that. So I think that there are one can think of the ways of the criticism of that long period that goes from the 30s to the 60s, which is the period of that Shackle for the wrong reasons calls the years of high theory. Which are the years of high theory? It's the years in which there is an intent, in my view, in my sort of view, I describe the history of thought increasingly in my courses, I should say, of four broad periods, of history of thought. So the first great period of the rise of classical political economy is the period in which you have a view. I tend to emphasize the relevance of policy and theory together. And so in the first period, you have a policy of laissez-faire, but coached with a theory that does not presuppose that markets are self-adjusted to positions of optimal, utilization of resources, particularly labor. Then you move through a vulgar era in which there is no theory of how exactly the laissez-faire would lead to optimal outcomes, but there is a belief in this optimal outcome. There is then the rise of marginalism, which it took me a long while to first notice this, but the vast majority of marginalists, including in the place where they were the central sort of strand of marginalism, which was at Cambridge, and Marshall and Pigou and then of course Sidgwick, that they were not for laissez-faire. They were perfectly fine with the notion that intervention was necessary because market imperfections were common. So some degree of government intervention was necessary because of these market imperfections. But they did think that the market economy did produce efficient outcomes. And then the years of high theory, exactly at the period in which it started with Sraffa's criticism of Marshall and then with Keynes' criticism of Say's law. And of course, Sraffa will build into the whole, and evolve into a critique of marginalist theory in general, theory of value and distribution, and abandon any Marshallian sort of supply and demand concepts. It's a period in which you have actually the conjunction of, another sort of, it's the economy does not produce optimal efficient outcomes, and you don't have, of course, any need of laissez-faire because, government can actively improve the situation in the economy. And the neoliberal vulgar era is exactly the reversal of this. We have now a theory, that suggests that the economy, as a result of the capital debate. So I think that that's an important thing that Garegnani was central in emphasizing with his 76 paper, one of his most important papers, in my view, in suggesting exactly that that there is this scape towards the intertemporal approach, and a lot of his work in his later years was in trying to, I think, rethink why the intertemporal approach is problematic. But this view in which you have really that the system is both self-adjusted to optimal levels and laissez-faire is better. And now it is because, yes, sure, there might be market imperfections, but government imperfections are much worse. And so that's where we are. And Garegnani is important in that because, while Sraffa certainly, I mean, you can think of Keynes and Sraffa. Keynes is going against Say's law directly, the idea that savings, that investment adjusts the full employment savings, through some mechanism. And Keynes, I would agree with Garegnani that there are issues in Keynes' solution of that problem, but Keynes goes about that sort of strand of the theory, whereas Sraffa, if you think of his early work up to the his transition, what he's trying to do up to the production of commodities, trying to show that the marginalist theory distribution doesn't work. But I think that the connection, it's made clear by Garegnani again. Although I think Sraffa knew about this, that those two criticisms, the two routes, if you want to criticize, to use a Garegnani term, two routes to effective demand, the two routes here to criticize marginalism lead to the same place, because you do need to get rid of marginalism in order to criticize Say's law. So I think that's a central sort of contribution of Garegnani. But here, if I may, I want to say, so I'm going to escape a little bit of what I think are his contributions. I should say one more thing before I go there. If I don't have time, Ricardo, you stop me and I'll bring back some of this stuff in my next intervention. I should say I do have the little thing when Garegnani went to the New School in 97, 98, I don't know, and gave a talk there, and I still kept it in my copy. It was translated into Spanish too, so I have my little copy of his dissertation that I ran long ago. I also, I read him way before I ever met him, and when I met him, we talked a lot about Celso Furtado, and I think a lot of Celso Furtado he spoke very fondly of Celso Furtado. Celso Furtado was writing at Cambridge the classic book on Brazilian development, and one of the key books on Latin American structuralism exactly at that point. And with qualms that one might have about Furtado's particular theoretical perspectives, I think that the project is the same, is to revive the ideas of Marx. When we say revive surplus approach and revive classical political economy, revive the ideas of Marx. What Sraffa did is to make Marx relevant, and that's what Garegnani was about too. And he makes Marx relevant at the same time that wanted to move these ideas of Marx to think about in the context in which demand is what drives the system in the short and in the long run. So it's this conjunction of Marx and Keynes, Marx and Kalecki, that is central to the project. And so I see that, the only thing that I would add, I think, is lacking in the Italian tradition, Italian Cambridge tradition of this, which was in the Latin American structuralist tradition, is this notion that but I don't think it lacks in the sense that they didn't, it's not developed in the same way for obvious reasons, because both England and Italy are at the center of the development of capitalism, whereas Latin America is in the periphery. So this notion of the peripheral aspects and the differences, so I think that that's sort of an interesting addition to that discussion. But exactly, that's why I was going to talk about something else, and I brought Furtado, because I think one of the things that I think it's a great misconception about this project, in particular in the view of post-Keynesians. And I say this with great respect because, Mark is one of those authors like Garegnani, like Franklin Serrano, like many others that I wasn't directly a student of, but they are almost like, my teachers in many ways. I've read them carefully. I have great respect. I've been heavily influenced by their thought and was lucky to talk to many of them and so on and so forth. But, is this notion that there is something important and distinctive about historical time that can be separated from the logical analysis and criticism of the labor theory, of the theory of value. And I think that there are just two theories of value, and the theory of value is necessary. And you either end up with some version, there's several versions, so of the classical, surplus approach to value and distribution, or you end up, and I should say there is a great degree of confusion on this, or you end up with some version, vulgar or not, of the marginalist theory of value and distribution. I think that one of the appeals of the intertemporal approach is that exactly because it avoids issues of the uniform rate of profit, because they have the several types of capital in physical terms, or in different ways, but and every single one of the settings of the model is a solution on itself. It eliminates the notion of a tendency to the long run, so it's a short run model all the time. This has been surprisingly interpreted by many heterodox people, and I think post-Keynesians in particular, and I think Joan Robinson here was insidious and negative. I don't think she thought this, but her interpretation has led to this view that you get in historical time, and that this neoclassicals are in a sense more modern and understand better because you have multiple equilibrium and possibilities of instability and things that are sort of cast away supposedly in classical political economy, which is not true. So classical political economy has perfectly all right in dealing with issues of history and institutions. So the whole point of the classical approach, Adam Smith is trying to explain the wealth of nations in a process that it's historical, in which you do have, of course, natural prices, call it whatever you want, natural production, normal prices, just prices, equilibrium ones, because you need to say something about the rate of profit and surplus. This surplus that is very well understood by all the other social scientists. They do think in terms, anthropologists, sociologists, all of these guys, when they go back, they look at the surplus approach as the basis of the origins of the social sciences in the 18th century. Sergio and Stefano had published a paper recently on this. It's in the Centro Sraffa which I recommend that everybody reads. I might have some differences on their sort of too generous description of Polanyi, but fair enough. Polanyi was an Austrian economist, and so there are problems with some of his Austrian views in terms of value and distribution. But at any rate, all of these things are absolutely perfectly compatible with classical political economy, with the idea that they're trying to discuss exactly the complexities of history and institutions in promoting the process of growth, but you have to have some analytical framework that allows you to talk about this. So the idea that we can have historical discussion without a clear analytical understanding of the core of the functioning of the economy seems to me, very problematic. And I think that Garegnani was central in clarifying this idea of the core. His paper, 84 paper on Marx and classical political economy, it's where the famous schematic sort of appears very clearly. I still use that with my undergraduate students. And it's the sort of thing that helps clarify, I think, some of these confusions, I think, in what sense then Sraffians are part of this revival of Marx, and in fact, the ones, in my view, pushing a coherent interpretation of how to advance Keynesian and Kaleckian ideas. Thank you.